This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. An expert on nuclear weapons says, don't panic about North Korea. The threats of using missiles against the United States are just empty bluster. A theologian calls out Catholic lawmakers by name to explain that putting reasonable restrictions on firearms is the pro-life position. And Bill Press talks with Chicago Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, who predicts eventual passage of gun safety legislation. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Joe Cirincione is president of the Ploughshares Fund and an expert on nuclear nonproliferation. He says don't worry about the empty bluster coming from North Korea. Its missiles can't hit anything. The only problem is the possibility of North Korea blundering into a conventional war. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Joe Cirincione is president of Ploughshares Fund, a global security foundation. He is the author of Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons and Deadly Arsenals, and is a member of Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Joe Cirincione, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Now, as an expert on nuclear weapons and an advocate for nonproliferation, are you pessimistic now that Iran and North Korea are apparently nuclear powers with an attitude?
Well, North Korea has nuclear weapons. They've tested 3 times, and the last one seems to have been successful. Iran is trying to get that capability, but they're still years away. It is a problem. It is a challenge to us. But here's the good news. We always talk about states like Iran and North Korea, but there are no states like Iran and North Korea. There's only Iran and North Korea. There's no other states racing to get nuclear weapons capability. If we can turn back these programs, if we can reverse this course, stymie Iran in place, isolate North Korea, walk back that program, we can start looking at the end of proliferation, at the end of this spread of nuclear weapons that began 67, 68 years ago. There used to be dozens of countries with nuclear programs. We're now down to a handful. So I see the optimistic scenario here beyond the current threats.
Okay. Now, after North Korea started making noises about attacking U.S. assets, President Obama said we would deploy 14 more anti-missile interceptors in Alaska at a cost of about $1 billion. Is that a big disappointment for the anti-nuclear movement?
It was a move that worked very well politically and diplomatically. It shored up our allies. It sent a message to China, put a real line in the sand for North Korea. The only problem is these anti-missile interceptors don't work. This is a deeply troubled program. There's a reason we'd stopped them at 30. They tested miserably. There hasn't been a successful test for any of these interceptors since 2010. And even then, they failed half of the tests that they had taken up to that point. So this is really sort of a symbolic move, a very expensive symbolic move. It's a little disappointing to see the Obama administration acting as if these things actually work. They know better.
Now, so they don't work, and you're not
alone.
Don't work. You're not alone in making that point. As non-technically as you can, why don't they work?
There's 2 basic reasons. One is there's real production problems with these things. In 2 of the recent tests, they didn't even get out of the tubes. And you have to understand, this was a very sloppily done program where they called it spiral development. They were going to test a little, deploy a little, test a little. The Bush administration wanted to sort of lock in missile defenses. They wanted to get them on the ground as quickly as possible, hoping that a president couldn't back out of them. In some ways that succeeded, but in the process they produced a very sloppy product. There's major manufacturing problems with these missiles. You would not buy one of these missiles. It was up to you. You wouldn't accept a a car that was produced like this thing was, but we're buying it as an anti-missile. But there's a more fundamental problem. It's the whole design of a ground-based interceptor system. A ballistic missile follows what they call a ballistic trajectory. After a brief period of powered flight, it sort of glides, coasts through outer space for an extended period before re-entering in the last few minutes to reach its target. Missile interceptors like the systems in Alaska try to intercept the missile while it's in outer space. That's where they try to hit it. And remarkably, if the conditions are ideal, we can actually hit a bullet with the bullet. And we've done that in tests. The problem is in real world, that bullet is not cooperating. It doesn't have a transponder on it like we use in the test, a little beacon that says, "Here I am, hit me." These warheads will be accompanied by decoys, little aluminum balloons like you have at a birthday party, or little pieces of wire the size of a paper clip that will jam the radar, produce a cloud around what's supposed to be a bright target spot, or jammers, little 1 watt or 5-watt jammers that will jam the radars. So the interceptor can't see the target in outer space. That's the main flaw with all these ground-based missile interceptors. We can hit a bullet with the bullet, but you got to be able to see it. To get around that problem, we don't test with decoys. Every test we do is carefully scripted so that it's only the warhead that's up there. There's no decoys in there. Until you can have a realistic test, the American public can't have any confidence that any of these ground-based interceptors are ever going to work.
We're speaking with Joe Cirincione, president of Ploughshares Fund, Global Security Foundation. He's also the author of Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons and Deadly Arsenals. All right, so the interceptors don't work as advertised. President Obama is still saying all the right things about nonproliferation, but he's still in favor of continuing to use them. I guess perhaps trying to deflect the criticism of the right that Democrats are too soft on defense, but wouldn't there be other ways to do that, since obviously there are plenty of people that know these things don't work?
Yeah. It's disappointing to see the president sort of rely on this prop of missile defense. You would hope he could move beyond it by now. And the only way to do that is to really present the American people with a comprehensive approach. A president hasn't sat down and talked to the American people about the nuclear threat in a very long time. It's about time the president did. What are we looking at? How many nuclear weapons do we actually need? It's hard to imagine a military mission for even one nuclear weapon. But suppose you said, well, we got to have at least maybe 10. Use of 10 nuclear weapons would be a catastrophe unprecedented in modern history. But you might even decide you need a reserve of them. You need 500 nuclear weapons just in case. We have 5,000 right now. What are we doing with 5,000 hydrogen bombs? And they're extremely expensive. They cost over $50 billion a year for nuclear weapons and related programs every year, year after year. The president needs to talk honestly with the American public about the real threats that are out there, the scale of those threats, and how the only way to solve these threats is to move step by step to get rid of these weapons. As long as they exist, this is the one weapon that threatens us as a nation. It's the only weapon that can destroy us as a nation. We'll be much safer off in a world with fewer weapons and eventually no weapons. We're the major superpower in the world. It's time for us to act like it, to lock in our military advantage for as long as we can. And the way to do that is to get moving to eliminate those nuclear weapons. That's what I hope the president will tell us in the months ahead.
Now, we don't hear much anymore about nuclear policy issues between the U.S. and Russia. Is it all in the past, or are there still some irritants there?
There are major irritants. I mean, there's clearly, domestic policy. Putin is tightening his grip on power, President Putin, the president of Russia. And they had cooperated with us in the past on reducing nuclear weapons. U.S. and Russian arsenals have come down dramatically. They're now about a quarter of what they were during the height of the Cold War, and we have a very good inspection regime where we know what they're doing and they know what we're doing. But Russia is still clinging to these Cold War weapons. They see them as their last, vestige of superpower status. It's the only issue where they deal with us on a sort of an equal level. And they are started, because they're conventionally inferior now, their army's deteriorating, they have major demographic problems in their country, shrinking population, a troubled economy. They still see these nuclear weapons as maybe being able to compensate militarily for some of what they see as the threats to their country. So they've been dragging their heels. And they've been concerned about U.S. deployment of missile defenses in Europe, thinking that's aimed at them, not Iran. But there may be some breakthroughs coming. I'm actually been meeting with Russians in side conversations about this, and there may be a softening on the Russian position. We may be able to make more reductions with them than the few hundred we made with the New START treaty. We'll know more this year.
You know, you mentioned Iran, and I'm thinking about Russia, China, folks that we have, let's say, cool relationships with. Where are they in all of these talks with Iran and North Korea and the whole thing? Why haven't we heard from them, and why aren't we using them to say, hey, look, you got to calm these guys down?
Yeah, well, for one thing, they tend to see the problem differently than we do. Russia and China see Iran differently. We think of it as an urgent threat that must be countered. They think of it as a problem that has to be managed. They have business relationships with Iran. China buys oil. Russia sells military equipment, or used to. And here's the good news. They have been cooperating with us, particularly since President Obama offered to reach out to Iran, offered to negotiate with them, wanted to make a deal at the beginning of his term and was rejected. That really helped show people where the real problem was. And after the president exposed the secret centrifuge facility that Iran was building at Fordow, near the holy city of Qom, that really ticked off the Russians and the Chinese, and they started to cooperate a lot more with us. They've signed on to the UN Security Council resolutions. They're participating in the sanctions. Russia is not selling military equipment to Iran. They lost $1 billion in one particular sale that was almost ready to go through. So they've made real sacrifices here, but they're not, they don't see it the same way as we do. On North Korea, China doesn't mind having North Korea being like a thorn in the side for the U.S. or a counter to South Korea or Japanese influence, but they don't want it to get out of control. China doesn't want a war on the Korean Peninsula. They don't want instability on their borders. They want 10, 20 years of international peace so they can undertake their economic development. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel was talking about this on his April 3rd speech about the mutual interest we have with China, and was reaching out to the Chinese to try to get them to cooperate to contain North Korea and start de-escalating this crisis. So there are areas we can cooperate. It takes some skilled diplomats and statesmen on our side to do it. Fortunately, we have a very good national security team at this point. We'll see if they can't make some progress on this in the months ahead. Okay, now before we let you go, two-part question. Overall, are you optimistic about whether we can stop the spread of nuclear weapons and prevent their use? And also, is the equation changed by the prospect of dirty bombs in the hands of terrorists? Yeah. Dirty bombs are a problem. That's not a nuclear explosive device. It's a conventional explosive, say a satchel of dynamite with some radioactive material like cesium mixed into it that would radiate 10 square blocks of an urban center, for example. That is a real problem. I'm frankly surprised we haven't seen that happen already. That's terrible, but the death toll will be relatively light. It's more of a economic disaster, as you can't use that radioactive area until you've cleaned it up. That could take years. I am very optimistic about getting rid of these 20th century weapons, nuclear weapons. There are fewer weapons in the world now than there were during the Cold War. There are fewer countries with these weapons. More countries have given them up over the last 25 years than have tried to get them. The tide is clearly towards fewer and fewer weapons. U.S. and Russian arsenals are clearly going to continue to come down, and the question is, what's the slope of that decline? How fast can we get them down before something terrible happens? There's a growing bipartisan consensus among the U.S. security establishment that whatever benefits nuclear weapons may have had during the Cold War, those are now outweighed by the risks they represent to our troops, to our countries, to our allies. That's why you see the president speaking the way he does. It's not some idealist notion. It's the new center of American realism. Fewer nuclear weapons make us safer. No nuclear weapons would make us safest at all. And when people like George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and Bill Perry and Sam Nunn are saying that, and Colin Powell and Jim Baker and others, these are the rock-solid center of the American security establishment. You know the president's on firm ground. I hope he can convince his staff to follow his lead and help him implement this world of peace and security without nuclear weapons.
Okay. Joe Cirincione, president of Ploughshares Fund, the Global Security Foundation, also the author of Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons and Deadly Arsenals. Joe, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much for having me on.
We enjoyed your time. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Catholic theologian Tobias Winright is calling out Republican leaders like John Boehner and Paul Ryan to make gun control part of the pro-life agenda. That's coming up in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Let's tally the bank robberies. J.P. Morgan Chase engaged in massive fraud to foreclose without cause or due process on innocent homeowners, tossing thousands of families into the streets. Goldman Sachs profited by marketing an investment package that was designed to fail, collecting millions from a side bet it made that, sure enough, its investors would lose money. HSBC has been butt deep in a swamp of illegal money laundering schemes, willingly processing billions of dirty dollars for vicious drug cartels and peddlers of arms to terrorist forces at war with America. Many more examples abound. These are not poor saps desperately robbing a branch bank for a few $100s, but criminal enterprises run by multimillionaire Wall Streeters who run in the finest social circles and hobnob with the nation's political elite. Their corruption is complete. Their crimes are documented. Yet, unlike sad sack bank robbers, not a single one of these robber barons has even been prosecuted, much less jailed. In fact, frustrated prosecutors in the Justice Department's criminal division report that when it came to Wall Street, there were no investigations going on. There were no subpoenas, no document reviews, no wiretaps. Where are the cops on the Wall Street beat? Up in the suites, coddling the culprits. That's because Attorney General Eric Holder and the chief of his criminal division, Lanny Breuer, have previously enjoyed lucrative careers as lawyers defending the very barons they're now supposed to be prosecuting. They know many of them on a first-name basis. Holder and Breuer both hail from the same Washington law firm, Covington and Burling, that specializes in representing corporate clients with legal issues at the Justice Department. This is Jim Hightower saying, see, when engaged in high crimes, it literally pays to have friends in the very highest of places.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Professor Tobias Winright of St. Louis University says the Catholic Church's consistent pro-life position should be extended to sensible gun control legislation, and he puts the Speaker of the House and a couple of Democratic senators on the spot. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats, Tobias Winright is Associate Professor of Theological Ethics at St. Louis University and a former law enforcement officer with experience in both corrections and policing. He is also co-editor of the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics and book reviews editor for the journal Political Theology. Tobias Winright, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
You're welcome. It's good to be with you.
And we're appreciative of you being with us. So you're part of a group of more than 60 priests, nuns, theologians, and 2 former U.S. ambassadors to the Vatican who signed a letter asking Catholic lawmakers to act on gun control. Was that a one-off move, or is there an organized Catholic lobby at work on gun issues?
Well, this is actually a group that pretty much belonged to a Google group called Public Theology, and we email each other regularly about things in the news that are of interest, usually having to do with moral questions and political issues. And in January, after the Sandy Hook massacre at Newtown, and in the wake of that, we were sharing articles about gun control and what is the Catholic Church teaching, or what are perspectives on that morally. And some of us decided to put together a statement that kind of drew together some basic elements of Catholic teaching about being pro-life, and we tried to make it apply to this issue about gun control. So there isn't an organized Catholic lobby that includes those of us who signed this statement, but there are ecumenical groups such as Faiths United to Prevent Gun Violence, for example, that pulls together Catholics and Protestants and others of other faiths that is advocating more gun control. The United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, the Catholic Health Association, and the Catholic Charities USA, they have issued statements on this, but there is not one unified, organized Catholic lobby that I know of working on gun issues per se.
Mm-hmm. Now, your group is asking Catholic lawmakers to take up gun control as a pro-life issue, but isn't singling them out contrary to the idea that our representatives are supposed to act in the best interest of the nation instead of their religion?
Well, that's kind of asking the question, I suppose, about the relationship between faith and politics, and is that a violation of our principle of separation of church and state? We wrote at this statement as Catholic theologians and social activists. We have the 2 former U.S. ambassadors to the Vatican and others a part of this, and we did say that we were writing especially to Catholic lawmakers, but we weren't only writing to Catholic lawmakers. In our view, gun control and gun violence, that's a pro-life issue. It's a moral issue. We're not talking about the Trinity or the Immaculate Conception of Mary here. We're talking about an issue that, murder is wrong, and regardless of what religion you belong to. So this issue for us is a moral issue that is not only a religious issue per se. And so what's in the best interest of the nation here versus the best interest of our religion is not really down to that. What we are concerned about here are what's in the best interest of those human beings who are victims of gun violence in this country. So we especially highlighted, though, some members of Congress who pride themselves for their pro-life stance. So we thought that we would at least designate that as our, portal for getting in there and saying, hey, if you want to talk pro-life, let's talk about this issue as well. And in so doing, it's not, in our view, singling them out in a way that makes them, face an either-or question about doing what's best for the nation or what's best, as a member of a certain religion.
Sure.
For us, we were trying to get them to really focus on this as a moral issue that's in the best interest of all.
Okay. Now, which members of Congress did you single out in that letter, and why just them?
Well, we could have singled out a lot of people, and then our letter would be a lot longer. But
right.
we singled out prominent Republicans and Democrats, both, So on the Republican side, we named House Speaker John Boehner. We named Representative Paul Ryan. On the Democrat side, we referred to Senator Joe Donnelly and Senator Heidi Heitkamp, and we highlighted them especially because they earned an A grade or rating from the NRA, the National Rifle Association. So we singled out them. We could have listed more, I'm sure, but kind of the tip of the iceberg there, those that got this A rating from the NRA, that's why we highlighted them in particular. And again, it's both Republicans and Democrats. And the same with those who contributed to our statement. The two former U.S. ambassadors, for example, one is Thomas Melody, who was a Republican. He was ambassador to the Vatican under the previous administration, President Bush, and the other one was Miguel Diaz, he recently retired as ambassador under President Obama. So again, it's a bipartisan group that contributed to the document, and we are calling on members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to address this moral issue.
Okay. Now, how effective would tying theology to gun control be, considering that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops some time ago put out a statement denouncing the House Republicans' budget plan as basically unchristian? I mean, that probably doesn't endear the bishops to the Republican caucus, and I would think you'd run into some roadblocks then with the gun issue.
Right. Well, obviously, the Catholic position of the U.S. bishops and the Catholic Church, it really isn't Republican or Democrat ultimately. It does go through both, sides of the aisle, and it's trying to be consistent, a consistent pro-life approach to questions that have to do with, life issues, from abortion to euthanasia to guns. And so, I mean, it might not endear the bishops to the Republican caucus, but that hasn't stopped the bishops from issuing statements, on the other side. That has not endeared them to the Democratic caucus either. So being effective and being endeared to either caucus, that's not the main concern for the U.S. bishops or for American Catholics. The main concern for us is to be faithful to our moral principles. And again, I'm talking about moral principles here and moral issues, and not about such things as the resurrection or the Trinity or the Immaculate Conception. We're talking about issues of life and death here. And so it might not be endearing to people on either side, but ultimately we think that these questions, they're not necessarily based on how someone views the Bible or reads the Bible, but they're ultimately based on reason and on human goodwill. And it's the old Catholic tradition of natural law, actually, that these are questions that people should be able to reason about. Even when we don't agree, we should be able to have a discussion, a fair debate, and try to figure out what is best for all and for the common good of this country.
Your group just happens to be Catholic. It's not about Catholic. It's not about Republican, Democrat. It's about humans, and that's what it comes down to. It's just life in general then. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and the Catholic tradition, that's always been an important element. We are Catholic theologians, most of us, that contributed to this statement, and there are, scriptural, there are, sacramental reasons why we are pro-life and have various issues about war and peace or abortion or whatever. But, when it comes right down to trying to engage our fellow citizens, including politicians, while we might invoke those things, ultimately, at bottom, we believe that these are issues that people of goodwill, using reason, should be able to have a reasonable conversation about in an effort to do what is best for people of this country.
Okay. Now, overall, Tobias, do you sense a shift in public attitude that might result in some gun control legislation?
Well, I mean, initially, right after the Sandy Hook massacre, there was quite a public, I think, attitude supportive of gun control legislation. But in recent weeks, it looks like, from what I'm reading, that polls are showing that American attitudes towards gun control legislation are getting back to about what they were prior to Sandy Hook. So President Obama, I think, addressed this recently, that we should not forget, and there are some groups that, with the passing of time, the NRA, they hope that Americans will tend to forget this and will shift in their attitudes back to what they were rather than being so opposed to gun control. I will say that American Catholics happen to be 62% are more supportive of gun control, whereas other Christians, such as evangelical Protestants, are only about 35% supportive of gun control. So, as a Catholic group, going back to the Catholic focus there, we kind of feel like this Catholics are especially poised to maybe help raise more awareness about this and pursue this for the good of our country, and to encourage deeper reflection on, who are we and what kind of country do we want here, and what should we do with regard to estimates go as high as 30,000 deaths per year from gun violence. I mean, that is a problem. That is a problem that needs to be addressed one way or another.
An unacceptable problem, really. Yeah.
Yes.
Tobias Winright, Associate Professor of Theological Ethics at St. Louis University, we really appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
I appreciate being here.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky.
First Lady Michelle Obama yesterday giving out in Chicago, speaking to a luncheon organized of business leaders organized by Mayor Rahm Emanuel. She gave a very powerful talk yesterday about her experience dealing with the family of that little 15-year-old girl who came here, marched in the inaugural parade, then went out to a park with her friends just a week later in Chicago, and was shot in the back by a gang member who thought that she might be another gang member. Really, it was just sort of like the Newtown tragedy, really had an impact on the First Lady yesterday, as she described, talking about Hadia Pendleton.
Hadia Pendleton was me, and I was her. But I got to grow up.
And that was the difference. Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, also representing the city of Chicago, very active on this issue of gun safety, joins us this morning on our newsline. Congresswoman, it looks like in the last couple of weeks the tide has turned on this gun safety issue. Would you agree?
I would agree. I would say even in the last couple of days that the Republican senators who had pledged to filibuster the bill, I think that filibuster effort is crumbling in the face of the Newtown families that came to Washington and this relentless pressure to do something, and a good number of Republican senators who say they will not block a vote on the bill.
It is impressive. The Newtown families, they flew down here. Well, I thought that was a very powerful statement in itself, flying down here on Air Force One to confront the members of Congress. And it just became impossible for some of these hardliners, right, to sit down with them and look them in the eye and then say no. Huh?
You know, the president has engaged in a really terrific campaign. You know, he started out all this sort of denigration of his being a community organizer years ago. You know, it pays off. Knowing how to use the strength you have with ordinary people.
So now it looks like, would you agree that with this breakthrough yesterday, and it really was significant, the breakthrough of Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey, and lots of credit to them, that this probably does mean that we will definitely get a bill out of some form out of the Senate? Huh?
Well, you know, we're not at the 51 votes yet in the in the Senate. I think so. You know, unlike other times, the Republicans or the NRA had talked about the Connecticut effect, that if you just wait, that the enthusiasm will ebb and this will go away, just like Columbine, just like you know, all the other times that there's been mass shootings. This time it isn't going to go away. And so I am feeling optimistic that we're going to get that bill out of the Senate. But regardless, this is a winning issue for Americans. We're going to get some sensible gun safety legislation, and it is really different.
And then if we and I'm optimistic that there will be a vote, there will be a debate. That today the big vote, of course, is cloture, right? Mm-hmm. It looks like enough Republicans will vote with Democrats that we will move on to a debate on the Senate floor. I'm optimistic there'll be some kind of bill, at least with background checks, hopefully more, off the Senate floor. But yesterday, when he was asked whether or not there's even going to be a debate or a vote in the House, Speaker John Boehner, you know, wouldn't. Dan, if we got that quick clip, here's the Speaker yesterday.
Well, we'll wait and see what the Senate does. It's one thing for two members to come to some agreement. It doesn't substitute the will for the other 98 members, and so we'll wait and see what the Senate does.
Boy, not a lot of enthusiasm there, Congresswoman.
You know, what a snippy comment, anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, really, I don't think he does himself any good. You know, here's the thing, Bill. The Republicans are hanging on to a disappearing electorate and a disappearing coalition that they could rely on to elect them. Even in some of the most rock-rib Republican districts, women, there's a gender gap when it comes to guns. Women want their children to be able to go to school and to the theaters safely. I think that this is going to be a losing issue for them if they grip onto this phony idea of that the Second Amendment is in jeopardy, which it is not. That they're going to continue to lose the constituencies that they're losing already. The immigrant populations, the minority groups, the women. This is a issue, I think, mainly embraced by white men. Romney won white men by 60%, mm-hmm. And you know this is not going to be a successful strategy for them, short term or long term.
No, they just seem to be tone deaf, as you point out, not only on this gun issue, but on so many issues. And that comment, I mean, this is a very, very important issue facing the American people, and for Boehner to just say, "Oh, we'll wait and see," right? You know, basically, like
91% of Americans support this bill.
Yeah, right, 91%, and they're representing, again, what, the 9% or maybe the 2%, right? Mm-hmm. I don't get it. I've got to ask you, Congresswoman. You saw we've talked before about sane fiscal policy and economic policy. We had a Senate budget and a House budget. Now we've got the president's budget. To the extent that you've had a chance to take a look at it or the highlights, what do you think?
Well, you know, there's plenty to like in the president's budget: early childhood education, raising the minimum wage, some investments that would create jobs, and then there's some things that are troubling to many of us: the changed CPI, some additional cost sharing in Medicare that will, raise the rates for many seniors and cut benefits in Social Security. So, I think there's a considerable pushback, but the only way that the president's recommendations become law is if it's part of a grand bargain that the Republicans would agree to. And despite the concessions on entitlement programs, John Boehner has already said a flat-out no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Mitch McConnell as well, right?
Yes, and Mitch McConnell, right.
Yeah. So whereas before they were saying, there's some of these these loopholes that don't make sense anymore, and we ought to really consider them. And then when push comes to shove, right, and the president gives them the opportunity to get the cuts that they've been demanding, as long as they give up some of those revenues, again, holding the line.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remind people that the change CPI was a Boehner-McConnell demand last December in the negotiations, and it was a bad idea then, and it's a bad idea now. But still, it was a Republican idea. Now we're hearing them trashing the Democrats or the president for recommending cuts to Social Security and Medicare. The utter hypocrisy is astonishing.
Is there, on final issue, quick question, is there anything going on? We hear, yesterday was a big demonstration, a big rally in front of the Capitol on
Huge.
Immigration reform. Yeah, when I saw the crowd, it was immense. And we hear about the Gang of Eight in the Senate. Anything going on in the House in a bipartisan way on immigration reform?
I think we're going to see a Senate bill next week, early next week.
Yeah.
That will be offered, and like the gun issue, I think we are it's all gelling and coming together. And once again, the battle, I think, will be mainly in the harder battle anyway in the House of Representatives, where the Republicans seem to be sticking to their old ways, their outdated ways.
Well, you keep the pressure on. I know you do.
We will.
Keep up the great fight, Congresswoman, and thanks for taking time for us this morning.
Thanks,
as well.
Bill, as always.
All right,
Appreciate
you're great. You're great. Love you. Jan Schakowsky, representing the state of Illinois in the United States Congress.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Joe Cirincione, Tobias Winright, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to America's Democrats.